Hey Rebel Riser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7, your daily dose of Star Wars joy, and thank you so much for joining me for it. And thank you especially to the people who help make this possible for you with their support at patreon.com/SW7x7. So this is it. This episode today is coming out on the 10th anniversary of when the very first episodes of Star Wars 7x7 were released, all the way back in 2014. The show debuted on Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, I guess at the time it was, with 4 episodes out. So there was an episode 0, 1, 2, and 3. And so by, one technical standard, technically July 4th could be considered the 10th anniversary because that was the date of that episode 0. But really, it went live on iTunes on July 7th, and that was as perfect as I had hoped it could be, because 7/7/2014, like the numerology of it was absolutely magical. And since that point, there has been a podcast episode put out every single day. Yes, there have been a couple of situations where there have been reruns, as it were, some old interviews that were reshared with new information alongside of them. But yeah, it's been a daily thing. And the crazy thing of it is that in 10 years, there's never been a time where I sat down and thought to myself, I don't want to do an episode of the podcast. I have sat down occasionally and thought, I don't know what I'm going to do for the next episode of the podcast, but something always comes to me, and it's always managed to be something interesting for me at least, and I hope it has been interesting for you over the years as well. I mean, I suppose that must be the case if you're listening to this or watching this, right? And bizarrely, it's just one of those highly unusual things to imagine, but if you even though I've done this every single day for 10 years, if you were to listen to every single episode of the show back to back to back to back, you would be able to do that in 1 month. In just the space of a month. I've been looking at stats and history and stuff like that for the show, of course, since we're at this particular milestone. And among the many shocking things are the more than 3.7 million downloads of the podcast overall. Like, that just seems absolutely mind-blowing to me. The show has been downloaded in more than 170 countries. I'm keeping track of the ones where it hasn't been downloaded yet. I know we're gonna get to those places. And last year was the year where the show was finally downloaded in the last continent, in Antarctica. So yes, Star Wars 7x7 has been listened to on all 7 continents, which is also an amazing, remarkable, humbling thing. I've been able to record the podcast in 5 different countries, which is pretty amazing, and also a dozen US states, which I guess was just kind of bound to happen if you have been doing a podcast every single day for 10 years. I've been lucky enough to broadcast from 6 different Star Wars Celebration events and from San Diego Comic-Con. I think possibly the absolute most amazing one of all of it, though, is the live broadcast that I got to do from Skellig Michael, which is the location where all the Octo scenes in the sequel trilogy were filmed. It's an island 9 miles off the coast of Ireland, and I was able to do a live broadcast from there. I can't even believe I got a cell signal out there too. But yeah, it's been an amazing ride, and it would not be possible without you. You listening to the podcast, you watching the podcast. Without you, this isn't possible. It's just me shouting into the void about Star Wars stuff. And so I am just massively grateful that you have decided to spend any amount of your precious time with me. And on the occasion of this 10th anniversary, there are also some people that I want to make sure I call out. First of all, Kevin Scarrett, who was the designer of the logo and the website back in the day. Stacy Lucas, who has taken on variations on the logo design and who also helped create this amazing studio space. There are a couple of podcasters who've been especially supportive over the years, including Tim McMahon, the host of the former Expanded Fandomverse podcast, and Dennis Keithley, who is the co-host of Podcast Stardust. They've become good friends over the years, which is an even bigger blessing. I also want to say thanks to longtime patrons, including Pam Johnson and Doug Howard. Between the four of them, they're doing a lot to keep the ring lights on and the streaming service streaming and all that wonderful stuff. Fred Butler, Rich Panamo, Bobby Gordon, Brian Fontaine. I also want to say thank you to Todd Vanderhayden, who is a news anchor in Canada, who was the first person to get me on television for interviews. And of course, there have been so many wonderful, kind, and supportive people at Lucasfilm Limited and their subsidiaries that I've gotten to interact with over the years. Some, just once or twice over the course of the time, and some many times over many years. I want to particularly shout out Rob Breedow, Scott Brooke Mayer, Tracy Canobio, Pablo Hidalgo, Matt Martin, and Michael Siglane. So many people have been so supportive for so long, and it's gotten me through some, very tough times as well. I mean, I was diagnosed with cancer at one point during the course of this 10-year run. That was back in 2017, and thankfully we got it all. It's all handled, and I'm now 7 years cancer-free. I survived 3 or at least 3 bouts with COVID-19. The first one of them before the vaccines were available, and the second 2 after I'd been vaccinated and booster shotted. Thankfully, the worst that happened to me was that I couldn't get through a day without taking multiple naps for about a month, and then I had a lingering cough for about 6 months after that. And yeah, it could have been a lot worse, and it was a lot worse for a lot of people. There was one loss, though, and it's not COVID-19 related. It's not even human related that has happened in the 10 years of the podcast that I haven't really talked about here on the show. And it's, still a little touchy for me. But those of you who have listened to or watched the podcast for a long time are familiar possibly with one of the 2 cats here, Indiana Jones Voivod, or Indy for short. Indy I had referred to as the senior producer of the podcast for a long time, and Indy passed away just a couple of months ago on May 20th. He was 14 years old, and it happened really suddenly. It was advanced kidney failure. And even if you didn't see him on camera on the video version of the podcast, the fact of the matter is that he was pretty much in the studio for almost every single episode that I recorded. In fact, in some of the early video days, one of the conceits of the podcast was when I was doing the introduction, I would lean to look off camera and say, punch it. That particular part of the video version of the podcast no longer exists. We just jump into the show, but the audio version of it still exists on all of your favorite audio podcast apps. But the conceit of that was that I was supposed to be looking off camera to look at Indy to start the opening credit music, or the opening title music, I guess I should say. And since then, since May 20th, I had definitely felt his absence here in the studio, and that has been a sad thing. But there have been so many, many beautiful moments over these past 10 years, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of them. I'm so grateful for the time that I've been able to spend with you here on the podcast, for the opportunities that we've had to meet in person at various conventions, for all the kind words that you've shared in your social media comments, in your ratings and reviews, even in the emails that you've sent privately to me. I'm just so grateful that you've allowed me to be a part of your life, whether it's just been for the last week or month or year or any part of the last 10 years. And now that we're starting on the second 10 years, I can say that the show is eventually going to look different. And I don't know quite yet how it's going to evolve. It has evolved before over the course of these 10 years, and it's going to evolve again. I'm kind of thinking of the first 10 years of the podcast as season 1, basically. I never really put a season number on it before, but I am basically considering season 1 of Star Wars 7x7 to be complete with these 10 years. Season 2 starts tomorrow, and it's going to probably seem the same for a little while, but yeah, things are going to be changing over the course of the next weeks and months and years, and I look forward to seeing where things go with you next. But before we wrap this up, I do want to say one last, final set of thank yous. First of all, to Quizmaster Joe and Scorekeeper Declan, my two boys who, when I started this podcast, were 11 and 6 years old and were helping me with the trivia episodes, and have since grown out those roles, are now 21 and 16 years old and are incredible young men who I couldn't be prouder of, and I'm just so grateful to be the father in their lives. And to Brainstormer Lonnie, as she's been known on the podcast, that's my wife who helped me conceive of the idea of this podcast. I would not have been able to do this without her and without her support over these 10 years. She has been my strongest champion for continuing to do this. This would not have been possible without her love and support and belief in me. And so, Lonnie, thank you for that. And with that, we're going to call it a decade here. If you have enjoyed the show for any length of time, you can get me a very simple anniversary present, and that is just by helping more people discover this podcast. Whether you're telling them in person or online, whether you're telling algorithms with your ratings and reviews and likes and comments and subscribes and follows and joins and all of that helps, and I'm so grateful for it. And you can even help me continue to produce this dose of Star Wars joy, and you can find out more about that at patreon.com/SW7X7. And it just remains for me to say thank you so much for joining me for this episode, as always. And may the Force be with you, wherever in the world you may be.
7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited, or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.